just takes a little while for us to get into that.
We'll begin Be'ezer Hashem by reviewing a fundamental machlokes rishonim, which is not so much a machlokes in the sugya of Shabbos directly, but is a machlokes in the malacha of bishul as a whole, which, as we'll see, has broad nafkiminas in the shitas rishonim in the sugya of Shabbos. The Rambam in Perek Tes halacha Gimel of Shabbos, at the end of the halacha, the Rambam says, "Hamavashal al ha'oir." If someone is mavashal over a flame, and the Rambam is coming just la fuke, told us chama and told us oir, the Rambam is speaking about the basic presentation of meleches bishul, which is being mavashal al ha'oir. And the Rambam says, if it is a dovar shahayu mavushal kol tzarkai, if it's something which is mavushal kol tzarkai, or dovar she'enei tzarech bishul klal, or something which is not in any way improved by bishul, potter, in that case, there is no malacha beraisa of bishul. The Kesef Mishnah is medayik, and the Kesef Mishnah says, Nir midivir Rabbeinu, implied in the Rambam's loshen that the case in which someone is potter from being mavashal al oyer is something that's mavushal kol tzarkai. Says the Kesef Mishnah, shekol dover shaloin is bashal kol tzarkai, something which is not mavushal kol tzarkai. Afal pi shehigia lamachal ben drusoi, even though it's already reached the stage of machal ben drusoi, shaykh be bishul v'chiyuve mechayev. That bishul from the stage of machal ben drusoi till what the Rambam calls mavushal kol tzarkai still involves a chiyuv deraisa. And as we're familiar, just to review, this is the psak of the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Yud Ches Sif Daled, where the Mechaber clearly paskins that something which is mavushal, even machal ben drusoi, still has a chiyuv deraisa of bishul until it's mavushal kol tzarkai. The Bir Halacha Afanart, it's important to add, it says, Kein hu das Rambam b'hatur. It says this, that there is melacha deraisa of bishul from machal ben drusoi until mavushal kol tzarkai, is the opinion of the Rambam in the Tur. And he says that there is a stiras hatesvus as to whether or not Taisus holds of this din. And he says, why is the Mechaber soisim l'chumra daloi harbe rishonim cholkim al zeh, the Bir Halacha says. There are multiple rishonim who disagree with this din of the Rambam and hold, and these are, among them are the Rashba, the Bir Halacha says, Rashba, Rosh, Ran, and Meiri, who are primarily in the beginning of Kira, where those Rishonim assume, as a Dover Pashat, that there is no bishul once the stage of Machal ben Drusoi has been reached. Kulam poiskim de mekibon shenes bashal k'Machal ben Drusoi shuv ein by bishul umutu lahachsir b'Shabbos, and that's matter even a chazara l'taner gorf. The maskana of the Bir Halacha is, and he says that afterwards, he says, I realized gamdas Rambam lav dafs yichidohu. The Rambam's day is held by Harbi min Rishonim. He brings the Arzurua, Oid Matzasi Chevel Rishonim, Sefer Atruma, Smag, Smak, Hagos Maimoni. And the Bir Halacha himself concludes that it's also mavur that's Shitas Rashi, that there is bishul deraisa from machal ben drusoi until it's mavushal kol tzarkai. It's relevant to add b'negei lahalacha l'maisa that b'di'eved, the Bir Halacha says, in lozus l'maisa mipsaka shulchan aruch u'mikomakom nir b'di'eved im hichsir ha'yisrael akder b'makom cham ein lesor hatabshul b'di'eved also yesh sofik plukta ein lesor b'di'eved. Since al kolpanim it's a broad machlokes rishonim, if there is bishul from machal ben drusoi until mavushal kol tzarkai, memela the Bir Halacha invokes the klal of the Pri Megadim that legabe di'eved we could be saimech on the shitas that are mekel, the Hainu, the Ramban, the Rashba, Udime. Right. So enochanami, that's negate to the sugya of bishul, and we'll see that even the Rambam is the pashtus besides das yochid and rishonim, that from a bushel called tzarka to mitzdamek v'yofalai is not considered bishul deraisa. And Beis Hashem Moisik in the sugyas of bishul will be oimed on why that is like that. We'll touch on it briefly later on Beis Hashem in this limud when we touch on the sugya of megis. But Al Kapanim, the Ikir Shitas Rishonim is broadly divides, like the Bir Halacha says, into two Shitas. The Shita of what the Bir Halacha assumes is the Rav Shitas Rishonim is that there is no Bishul Deraisa from after the stage of Machal Ben Drusoi. Shitas Rambam is that as long as it's not Mavushal Kol Tzarkai, there is Bishul Deraisa. That's the premise of this limud. Now, on this Shitas Rambam, that there is Bishul Deraisa from the stage of Machal Ben Drusoi until Mavushal Kol Tzarkai. On that, the Ramach asks a Kushya Atzuma, which we'll see Be'ezer Hashem already has a Sheirish in the Rishonim, but we'll begin with the way the Ramach asks the Shaila on Shitas Rambam. He says, in Kein Lidvarov, according to Shitas Rambam, Heyach muter lishois al gabi kiro grufa uktuma dovar hatzorich loilechol balayla nechush dilma megis. Zot the Ramach, we have a sugya on Daf Yud Ches in the days, where the Gemara discusses, the Gemara is actually in the sugya of Shisas Kelim, what malachas can be begun on Erev Shabbos if the malacha will then continue during Shabbos itself. And the Gemara says, Afilu tema Beis Hillel, even Beis Hillel who hold that there is no din of Shisas Kelim, the reason why there is a din that one cannot be memale a yoiro with its semer on Erev Shabbos in order that it should be koilet b'tzeva, in order that it should absorb the dye. Zot the Gemara, the reason for that is because gzeira shema yichate b'gichol. We're choishesh that in order that the heat should enhance the absorption of the tzeva, so therefore there's a chashash that will be chite b'gichol. Zot the Gemara, semer la yoira ligzoir. Why do we have the chashash of chitui by tzemer? Amar Shmuel be yoira akura. The only way in which we can avoid the chashash of chitui, which will allow us to place tzemer in a kedera on Erev Shabbos, is in the yoira akura. Rashi defines a yoira akura means that it was removed from the ish. Me'ala ur was taken off the fire. Then that the Gemara asks the kasha v'nechu shemo megis ba. We should have a chashash that there'll be megis, which means, to explain what the Gemara has now presented, even according to the Tana that holds that there's no Isser din of Shvisas Kelim, which means a malacha can be commenced on Erev Shabbos and will continue on its own to proceed during Shabbos. Nonetheless, if one places tzemer in a yoira, tzemer in a pot of dye, that the tzemer should absorb the tzemer should absorb the tzeva during Shabbos. The Gemara says, leaving aside the chashash and the isser of Shisas Kelim, there's a din of chashash shema yichate. On that, the Gemara says, the only solution the Gemara presents for that is a yoira akura. That the yoira was removed from the ish. On that, the Gemara then goes and asks further, even if we have solved the chashash of shema yichate, nechu shema megis ba. Rashi learns, and we'll see that this, as you proceed, this is actually machlokes rishonim. Rashi understands that the issue of being megis, the possible issa deraisa is mehapich ba and havi bishul. Meaning by stirring the yoira, which contains the tzeva, megis is an issa of bishul. Just to explain that briefly, even though again, these are the yisodis and melechas bishul, not directly relevant to Shia. The Gemara in Be'od Aflam and Albam and Beis brings a braisa that even after the kedera is put al gabi ha'esh and the bishul is progressing, if someone is megis, if someone stirs the kedera, the person who is megis is chayiv midiraisa mishum bishul. The Rishonim say because he's memaher bishulay. And we'll come back to Hashem during this limud to try and define more precisely what memaher bishulay means. But there is a braisa mefureshes that being megis while bishul is in progress involves an issa deraisa. So Zod the Gemara v'nechu shema megis ba. Other Rishonim will learn, as we'll see later, that the issue of megis is not because of bishul. The issue of megis is because they being megis that will enhance the absorption of the tzeva, which involves the issa of malacha deraisa of tzeva. But Rashi shita is a chashash mahapich ba u'b'muvushal havi bishul. the Ramach.
Ask a question if the Rav doesn't mind repeating the question. Is there a functional difference between mechata and megis? Megis means in the pot and mechata is dafka in the b'cholim, or is it used interchangeably? You don't mind.
In other words, the question is there a difference between functionally what mechata accomplishes in the kedera and what megis in the kedera itself does? It's an excellent question, and towards the end of the limud, we'll come back to address that question directly. So now we're turning to the Ramach. The Ramach has quoted a Gemara, the Gemara in Daf Yud Ches, which we just saw, where the Gemara is muvur that what solves the problem or the chashash of Shema Yechata, in the case of the Gemara in Daf Yud Ches, namely a yoira akura, does not necessarily yet solve the chashash of bishul, which would happen through Shema Yagos. So Zok the Ramach, according to the Rambam, since there's bishul is possible from Macho ben Drusoi until Nizbashal Kol Tzarkai, so how do we begin the sugya of the beginning of Kira that Gorofun Kotum should allow Shehiyah? Gorofun Kotum only solves the problem of Shema Yechata. But Zot the Ramach, we have a Gemara Mufureshes that even Yoira Akura, where it's not even on the Eish at all, we remain with the Chashash of Shema Megis. Which means while bishul is in progress, and that's what Shlomo was asking before, what functionally is the difference in Shema Yechat and Shema Yegis in terms of enhancing the progress of the bishul? But we see clearly from the Gemara that there are two distinct processes by which bishul can be progressed. One is chitui and one is megis, and they're two separate chashashes, and what solves one doesn't necessarily solve the other. The only recourse the Gemara has to solve the chashash of megis is where it's toch, where the person has sealed the yaira. So therefore, he won't go ahead to break the seal, open the lid, and be megis. So frek the Ramach, b'fishitas Rambam, harei lo oilom, there's bishul until it's nigmar bishuloi. So whenever one is mashe until gmar bishul, there's always the possibility of bishul deraisa. So we should always remain with the chashash of bishul. To see the lashon of the Ramach inside, it says heyach mutal lishay sal gabi gira kiro gufu tuma dovar tzarich lelecha balayla nechush dilma megis kedegazizrinon betzemer la yoira diboinon akura v'tucha elolav. Says the Ramach, we're forced to conclude the kol dovar shen is bashal to Machal ben Drusoi. Once it's already reached the stage of Machal ben Drusoi, im mavashla yoiser ein boy mishum mavashla. The only eights that the Ramach has is to argue on the Rambam in the dinim of bishul, which means that the Ramach, to answer the shaila, hasn't changed his basic premise that every case of kira of Shehiyah has in it two chashashas, Shema Yechata and Shema Megis. And what solves removes the chashash of Shema Yechata doesn't take care of the problem of Megis. According to the Ramach, what's the only solution to the problem? The only solution to the problem is to say that there's going to be no bishul after Machal ben Drusoi. Now, let's pause for a moment to understand what the Ramach has just said. It's not moving. Because according to the Ramach, let's leave aside the Rambam for the moment. Let's focus on who the Bi'alacha calls Roiv Shitas Rishonim, that the bishul is only from Dover Chai until Machal ben Drusoi. Fine. So now, let's make a simple cheshbon. Can one leave a kedera less than Machal ben Drusoi if the kira is garf and cotton? What's the din? What's the halacha? Zog the lashon Rabbi Kiva Eger, to quote the lashon of Rabbi Kiva Eger in Chidushim. Rabbi Kiva Eger says, to quote his lashon, he says, "Mevur b'kol hasugya." It's not clear what Rabbi Kiva Eger means like that, but this is his lashon. He says, "Mevur b'kol hasugya ubatur shulchan aruch," that one can be masha a kedera which hasn't yet reached Machal ben Drusoi on a kira gufal ktuma. What's Rabbi Kiva Eger's raya? It's not clear what he means from kol hasugya, but we can know clearly what Rabbi Kiva Eger means when he says from the whole Shulchan Aruch. Because if we look in Shulchan Aruch, where the Mechaber brings the shita of those Rishonim, that paskin like Hananya, that once the Tavshil has reached Machal ben Drusoi, there's no longer a chashash of Shema Yechata. What's the lashon of the Mechaber? The Mechaber says the Yesh Oimrim. What's their shita? Zok the Mechaber, the shita of the Yesh Oimrim is Kolshin is bashal kamachol ben drusoi, oin is bashal kol tzorkoi mutala shoysai. Ve'afilu eina grufok tuma. Where does one require grufok tuma? But like huskor grufok tuma, but huset bekasha gvova, elo kashehischeli his bashal, ve'loi higia lemachol ben drusoi. So we see mafurish in the mechaber that if we pass him like Hananya, one can take a tavshil that was nizbashal ktsas, tikidruchaisa, and one can be mashet on grufo ktuma. Once it reaches machal ben drusoy, according to Hananya, that's the Yesh Oimrim, we don't need grufo ktuma. But where it's not yet reached the stage of machal ben drusoy, one can be mashet based on grufo ktuma. Fektach the shaila, if the Ramach has said, based on the Gemara in Daf Yud Ches, that every instance of Shehiyah really has two chashashes, Shema and Megis. So heichon motzinu yodeinu v'ragleinu, harei, it's mafurish in the Mechaber, and Rabbi Kiva says it's mafurish in the whole sugya that way. That grufu ktuma is an eitzah for the chashash of Shema Yechata, even if it hasn't reached the stage of Machal ben Drusoi. That's the case where Hananya requires grufu ktuma. Harei, all the Rishonim agree that prior to the stage of grufu ktuma, there's bishul. So how can the Mechaber say that one can be mash as something that's not gorf and kotum? Al gabe kira, because grufu ktuma helps, even though it's less than machal ben rusoi. Granted, it will solve the issue of chitui, but what about the issue of megis? The Ramach's answer to the Rambam is that the way Perek Kiro works is only by assuming that there's no bishul beyond machal ben drusoi. And what about Koydem Machal ben Drusoi? Avada Kulei Al Mamoida, there is. Kanire, what we're muchrach to say, and we'll return to this point later, when we see Rabbi Kiva in the Gilin of the Shulchan Aruch.
This kasha is repeat the question, please.
Now, after Machal ben Drusoi, the Ramach says there is no issue of Megis, because what's the issue of Megis at Rashi? Because it will be Mavashal. So Zot the Ramach, you're right. We'll argue with the Rambam. There's no bishul acham mechel ben drusoi. So Adar Abba. And it's mefurish in the Mechaber that in Hananya, that's the case where according to Hananya we need Ga'or from Katum is before it's machal ben drusoi. Now there's no reason to assume, and we'll turn to this point later, that the first sheet in the Mechaber that's machmir like Rabbanon and requires gruf of ktuma even beyond machal ben drusoi, will argue with the fact that gruf of ktuma is an eitzah with less than machal ben drusoi. Why should there be a machlokes about that? The machlokes just is, do we require gruf of ktuma beyond machal ben drusoi? But if gruf of ktuma solves the problem of chitu before machal ben drusoi, the same way as the Mechaber says that according to Hananya does, there's no reason to assume that according to Rabbanon it won't. If so, the Ramach l'chayra hasn't addressed a much broader question. Leave aside the Rambam for the moment. If we have a right to draw a parallel between a yoira of tzemer and any bishul and say that the same way as the Gemara has Shema Yechata and beyond Shema Yechata the Gemara has a chashash of Shema Megis, so then Koydem Machal ben Drusoi we should have the same problem. Al Karchach will be muchrach to say that Rabbi Kiva Eger says that it's muvur the kol hasugya batur b'shulchan aruch that grufo ktuma allows shehiyah prior to machal ben drusoi is a machlokes rishonim, and the Ramach holds that enochanami one cannot be mashe b'pochos machal ben drusoi because of the chashash megis. So let's just now summarize what the point that we've arrived at, which means according to Hananya, grufo ktuma is never relevant, according to the Ramach. Because less than machal ben drusoi, there's a chashash megis, which grufo ktuma won't solve. And once it's reached machal ben drusoi, there's no need for grufo ktuma. So according to this shita, according to Hananya, there's no case where grufo ktuma is ever relevant. And the emissaries, we find this mufurish in the Rashba, that the Rashba in the beginning of Kira is musupik about this very shaila. Is grufo ktuma moil for something that's less than machal ben drusoi. But now, and we'll return to this point. For those who've seen the Rashba, it's important to note that the Rashba suffix is only a suffix of Shema Yechate, meaning the Rashba says that perhaps something that is placed al gabe kira, despite it being grufu ktuma, since it's not yet machal ben drusoi, there's more of a push to be mechated, and therefore there should be a chashash of Shema Yechate. The Rashba never directly addresses in kira, in Perek Kira, the chashash of megis. But what we could say is that according to that side of the Rashba, that the Rashba learned the sugya, that the Garf and Kotum won't be an Eitzah for Pachas Machal ben Drusoi, we'll say that there's another reason why Garf and Kotum won't be an Eitzah for Pachas Machal ben Drusoi, and that's because of Chashash of Megis. So, Be'oifen, that what we'll have to assume according to the Ramach is that the Ramach will learn the sugya al derech the Rashba, that there is no possibility of being Masha al Gabe Kedera, less than Machal ben Drusoi, not because of Chashash Chitui, which is the Rashba svar in the beginning of Kira, but because of Chashash of Megis. And we'll come back to this point, which we'll see that Rabbi Kivega B'Teich Dvarov will reference this cheshbon that we just made. But it's important
Even
to
though in the Mechaber there's no mention of Megis whatsoever, and I get that's really rough catch.
Correct. So so now that that's been brought up, and just to summarize the question, it was asked that the Mechaber doesn't seem to mention the Chashash of Megis at all. We will see Be'ezer Hashem, and it's important to this is because this is an issue halacha l'maaseh, that on those words of the Mechaber that we were medayek, that even if the Tavshel was only hischil his bashel, Gorf and Kotum will allow Shehiyah. Yeah, sure, with pleasure. So this is in Rishon and it's yes, it's Rishon and Gimel Sif Aleph. It's in the Mishnah Berurah's in the standard Mishnah Berurah's pages. That's on the fourth Amud of Mishnah Berurah.
Page 74. No, 74, right? Are you there? You hear me? Not in someone more please put it up. It's important to see
this is in the booklet of Maramah Famous. This is on page 74.
74.
I'm sorry. It should actually be. I apologize.
That's on 74.
Download. Here. Yeah, it's actually on page 70. It's actually on page 70.
73.
I'm sorry, it's actually page 75 in the book.
75.
75 in the book. Page Memhe in the Mishnah Berurah's pages. Page 75. I apologize. The standard Mishnah Berurah, this is on the opposite side of the page. So the Bir Halacha is similarly medayik, this lashon of the Mechaber. And on those words, is bashel, he says, and we'll return to this Bir Halacha, he says, Ayin b'chidushe Rabbi Kiva Eiger shekosav the din ze einoi bor. The yesh poiskim shesoivrim dafilu grufu ktuma loi mahani bezeh. What's the Bir Halacha referring to? The Rabbi Kiva Eiger references in the Gilyon of Shulchan Aruch this Ramach, where it emerges from the Ramach that the Ramach will hold that where it's not yet Ma'achul ben Drusoi, then there's a Chashash of Megis. And that's what the Bir Halacha is saying, and seemingly he's choshesh to this Rabbi Kiva Eiger Ladina, that the Mechaber doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be concerned with the issue of Shema Megis, seems to be Keneged Rishayin. So this Bir Halacha will refer to, but now that it was brought up, why this is absent from the whole discussion in Siman and Gimel, the Bir Halacha is saying that Rabbi Kiva Eiger points out that this should be included in the discussion of Shulchan Aruch, and for whatever reason it isn't. So if we now continue, we have the kasha of the Ramach. That the Ramach is assuming that prior to Machal ben Drusoi, there will be a Chashash Megis. And therefore, the only way in which we can begin perakira, so to speak, that Garif and Kotum will enable Shahia, is only by being mechadish that there must be a stage in which there's a chashash chitui, but no isser of bishul. Zok there, that's Kava Kolchach connected the Rambam. That's the. The Rabbanon are only discussing the chashash of chitu beyond Machal ben Drusoi, but then what we'll have to say is that since beyond Machal ben Drusoi there's no bishul according to those Rishonim, which is the day of the Rashba, the Ran Udimei that the Halacha brought in Shinut Ches, which we started with. Therefore, there's no chashash of Megis either. That will be the essential cheshbon of the cheshbon of the Ramach. Now.
Let's mind repeat the kasha. So now we have a problem here, basically, in the Ramach. Yes, that's what we're holding?
Correct. What we've done is we've established that the question of the Ramach is broader than the way the Ramach presents the question. The Ramach focuses his question on Shitas Rambam on the stage of Bishul from Macha ben Drusoi until Mavushal Kol Tzargai, and says that unless we create a band of extended Bishul, which is absent of the possibility of Bishul Deraisa, we have no way to allow Shahia. Right? Now the question is, fine, we'll accept that premise. And we'll then accept the day of what the Bir Halacha calls the Roiv Shitas Rishonim, that Bishul ends at Machal ben Drusoi. So now let's focus on the initial stage of Bishul, which is from Chai to Machal ben Drusoi. So there's a Chashash Megis there. But is Shahia Mutter at that stage? Rabbi Kivega tells us that from Tur Shulchan Aruch, and we showed the Lashon Shulchan Aruch, and from the Stimas Asugya, Shahia would be effective in that case. And if there's Garif and Kotum, would be Mutter. There's a Chashash Bishul. Muzmin Zogan, according to the Ramach, that Enochanami, that Garif and Kotum, before Machal ben Drusoi, Garif and Kotum would not be an Eitzah for Shahia. And this will be the question which we'll see in Rabbi Kiva Eger, that the Shulchan Aruch that does hold of Shitas Rambam, like we began with the Shinut Ches, that there is Bishul from Machal ben Drusoi until Gemar Bishulai, should have Chashash Megis throughout. Va'oy, the Shulchan Aruch is makel to allow Shahia, even according to Chananya, before Machal ben Drusoi, and there L'kuli Amad there should be a Chashash Megis. And we'll return to both those problems, but let's proceed in the sugya step by step. Now, we could immediately dismiss the premise of the Ramach's kasha and say that Shitas Rambam is that the sugya on Daf Yud Ches, which discusses a chashash megis, which is bishul, beyond grufuk tuma or akura, which takes care of the problem of chashash chitui, is specific to tseva in a yaira. It's only in that case that we're choishesh for hagasa. And it's meduik like that in the Rambam in Perek Gimel. From his ma'ayin, that the Rambam in Perek Gimel brings the chashash of shema megis. The entire Perek is discussing Shahia, and yet the Rambam only invokes the chashash of megis when he specifically discusses the sugya in Daf Yud Ches of yaira. Simple mashmos of the Rambam is that megis is an issue by yaira dafka. Yesod Advarim is in the Ramban and Chidushim on Daf Yud Ches in the base, where the Ramban says that the chashash of megis was dafka said the Gabi Tzeva, where we choishish for a megis which isn't there by other bishul.
Isn't there a Lashon Shema Megis Kedera? Isn't that mashma that Hagasa is beyond the Yaira? Hagasa is like Kedera too?
So the Nakuda would be a Kedera that's only Mamula with Tzeva. Meaning the Chiluk is not so much Yair and Kedera, the Chiluk is between Tzeva and Ans. Now, the Yesod Advarim is in the Ramban, as we mentioned, but we can make two Shahia Cheshbainis. So perhaps create a strong smach to this mahalach that Hagasa is a chashash by Kedera Dafka. For example, let's mention a couple of them. The Ramah in Siman Reishon and Daled in Sif Hey discusses whether or not one can be masher on a kira that's not Garif and Katum if one is not going to use the tafshel on Shabbos at all. one is being masha l'tzoirech moitzoi Shabbos. So the Ramah says that in a case when one was being masha l'tzoirech moitzoi Shabbos, the yesh lo izman nefoisei muter d'lo gazurim l'bechai gav n'shem yichat. Doesn't need it. It's important to point out that the Mishnah Berurah says in Sivkot Lamed Ches, he says that the Magen Avraham says that in our Tanurim that one can be roi there. One isn't soymech on this because cheshinon shemi molech lechol ma'pas. We're choshesh that he may change his mind and remove it. That's a technical. Let's tell you on the technical differences between Tanurim Shalom and the Tanurim of the Ramah speaking about. But being mashal l'tzirich mitzvah Shabbos is mutter. So how does the Gemara say that there's a chashash shema yichate, which requires yaira akura? He's not using the tzemer Shabbos. What's the chashash? The tzemer is put in Erev Shabbos, and not loy that the usual way of the tzemer is it stays there in the yaira for quite a while, but he's not using the tzemer Shabbos. The tzemer there's nothing to do with the tzemer Shabbos. The tzemer is not for Shabbos. The tzemer is clearly for after Shabbos. So why is the chashash shema yichate? Elomai, what's mavur in the Gemara is that b'makom where someone is dying tzemer, there's an entirely different, intricate involvement that the tzabo has with the tzemer than the person has who's being mavashal. Kanira, and that's a lashon of the Ramban, the tzayveya keseder is involved with the kedeira to be chayte, to be megis, kedei that the tzeva should be niklat. Exactly. So therefore, it's dafka in the same way as we see by chitui that there's a chashash by megis, there's a chashash by tzemer layira. So then we can say that by megis also it describes an entirely different mitzias.
I've learned about שהייה is that there's a concern with the Hilchos because of food. Food is very special. Otherwise, people are not abriyanim. This looks like a different type of a yid that we're concerned about doing malachas on Shabbos.
What shema yichate?
With
but
it's a different type of a yid we're worried about. More like someone that's going to cut corners on Shabbos. Not so much that they're bohel on food and they lose their mind. Because and therefore, I mean, but in other words, what you're suggesting is that we only find the chashash of Shem Yechata, like the Rosh says, because Klal Yisrael are doyeg for Einik Shabbos and v'lo yishmu lanu. Is that machriach that therefore there's no chashash Shem Yechata by anything else either? The Rosh is saying is that Klal Yisrael particularly are bohu for achila. But the Gemara is establishing that whenever a person has put a bishul in process, he always wants to make sure that the bishul proceeds correctly.
And it certainly doesn't speak to Mekis in a
Correct. So we can show from a cheshbon in the sugi of שהייה that we're speaking that there's a greater involvement of the tzayveya. Another point is, which is again negel halacha, is that the bir halacha, and a very fun, very important bir halacha, is that the bir halacha in the beginning of Siman Reish Nun Gimel, Dibra Maschel Hashai Saleh, brings the lashon. He brings the lashon of the Tur, that the chashash of Shema Yechata is only where the tafshil is going to be used l'tzorech halayla. And he says, in kavanosel l'tzorech mochar, but if the tafshil is being put away for tomorrow, not kidrochaisa, but lehedya, the tafshil is only for tomorrow. Zot the bir halacha yesh poiskim shematirim to lechashin on sheva yom lechatois. Ledina the bir halacha says we're not saying on that. Brings on Eli Rabbah. So even if lemoitze Shabbos, there are rishonim who are chiluk on that Ramah. L'tzorech mochar is also another machlokes rishonim. Mochar tzeva certainly is not l'tzorech halayla. He's machnas at l'kadeira. It's not l'tzorech halayla. And yet we again have a chashash of Shema Yechata. Vaistach ois again. There would be a strong smach from these rishonim that the nidin in the sugya of Yoyer Latzeva is fundamentally different from the sugya of Shema Yechata by Tavshilin. That would be a basic mahalach to answer Shitas Rambam from the kasha of the Ramach. But to point out that this would then solve both problems, meaning we wouldn't have a chashash of Shema Yegis, according to the Rambam, from Macha ben Jusoy to Mushal Tzarkai, who adin, we would dismiss the kasha that we asked on the Ramach, even from Davar She'einu Mevushal, until Macha ben Jusoy, because the whole chashash of Shema Yegis doesn't apply bichlal in the sugya of oichel or kedera. It applies exclusively in semalayira, as we tried to show from the chashash of shema yechata. That would be correct. Now, what will now proceed in the limud is we'll accept the premise of the Ramach that the shema yechata and shema yegis of the sugya by tzeva is identical to that by any tafshil. And l'chura, despite that kasha, l'chura, we again have a very straightforward dichui to the kasha of the Ramach. And that is that the Ramach and the Rambam are l'shitosom in the yesod of what Goruf and Kotum accomplishes. I imagine that the Olam has discussed this Nikuda, that the Shitas Rambam is that what Goruf and Kotum accomplishes, what the Rambam in the end of Paradigma Halacha Daled is, Shaharei Siach Daitoi Me'atabshil Ve'in Goizrim Shema Yechata Be'esh. On that, the Kesef Mishnah brings the Ramach, and he says, I don't understand how he's being Mesiach Das. Adrabi, he needs the Tabshil, or Yisei Laila. He's not being Mesiach Das B'chlal. He says, Milo Askin on the Inlet Tabshil Achikim Zeh, and he says, Vatama Noch and Ovid Heker, which is the Svara that many Rambam the Ramach. So this Machloikes is a basic Machloikes in terms of what Goruf and Kotum accomplishes. Does it accomplish the Shitas Rambam that he Siach Daito ve'in Goizim Shema Yechata Be'esh, Siach Daito Yimenu, or because he's made a Heker which will then prevent the possibility of Chitur? Maybe we could say the following. The Rambam's shita is that the same way as whatever removes the chashash of Shema Yechata accomplishes Hesech Hadas, so therefore the same way he's Mesiach Das from the Tabshil, he's not going to be Meigis either. That's what Hesech Hadas means. Hesech Hadas means by definition, one isn't involved anymore with the Tabshil. He won't do anything. It doesn't require specifically a heker according to the Rambam. It requires a maisa by which the person has made concrete his hesach hadas, either because it's exer derabanan that the hesach hadas only takes place through a maisa, or because it's only through a maisa hesach hadas is initially accomplished. However, we understand the yesod of why it will require maisa to be mesiach das. But the Rambam says one's mesiach das. We say that Dvarim is in Chazayni Cheskel in his Chidushim on Shabbos and Tafyot Ches. That the Ramach is like Koshemidi. The Ramach who didn't accept the Rambam's understanding of Hesach Hadas, therefore understood that it's only because somehow by making a heker that accomplishes a solution to the Chashash of Chitui. So Memela, there are Machle Shitoso who never fully incorporated Hesach Hadas, even B'Shittas Rambam asked that there remains a Chashash Megis. But the fear the Rambam that the Chashash of Hesach Hadas is, like the Lashon of the Kesef Mishnah is, that Kimlu L'Chachomim, that a person is Mesiach Daitoi Al Yidei Maisa, despite the fact that he may need to be involved in the Tabshil. He needs the Tabshil O'isei Laila. Memela, how the Rambam, that even though he has to be involved in the tzeva, and the normal way is to be involved in the megis in the tzeva, like the Ramban says, the Hesach Hadas accomplishes that.
We see that first the one had a problem with Shema Yechata, the one answers whatever the text of it.
Right.
And now maybe the other.
So we'll get to that shaila. We'll get to that shaila in a moment. And Bli Neder, then I'll repeat the shaila for the item. So this is the mahalach in the Rambam, very basic mahalach suggested by the Chazon Yecheskel, that the Rambam is lishitosai. Now, again, we asked that beyond the Ramach's kasha from the stage of Macho ben Drusoi to Gemar Bishul, there's the issue of Shehiyah from Tchilas Bishuloi until Macho ben Drusoi. And the answer is the same solution. Whatever will remove the chashash of Shema Yechata, l'shitas Rambam will accomplish Hesach Hadas. So Memela, we accomplish a chashash of Shema Megis. Now, it's important to point out that the answer is limited because it's Dafka the Rambam who holds that Goruf and Kotum accomplishes Hesach Hadas. Roiv Rishonim al derech haramach, that's because of Heker. So according to those Rishonim, who that's out of the Rashbu Dimei, that one can be Masha, Grufu Ktuma, prior to Macho ben Drusoi, we can't invoke the Rambam's Hesach Hadas because it requires heker, and heker doesn't accomplish Hesach Hadas, which won't be a solution for Megis. But l'shitas Rambam minei ubei, we have the Chazoni Cheskels. We have the Chazoni Cheskels. Now, l'fum riata, the teretz of the Chazoni Cheskel is meraps and igri, and this is what was being asked before. Let's go back to the Gemara. The Gemara, when discussing the din of being shoyet semer, the Gemara first asked Shema Yechate, and the Gemara says it's a Yoyer Akura that's off the Eish. Then the Gemara says there should be Chashash of Megis. Hagabatzmacha. Is there any greater Hesach Hadas than removing it from the Eish entirely? And yet the Gemara still said that there's a Chashash of Shema Megis. So the Ramach's Kasha is Eisen. And to just say that whatever accomplishes Hesach Hadas, for Chashash Chitu accomplishes Hesach Hadas, but Negea to Megis is Keneged the Gemara. It's a Gemara Mufuresh, it's not that way. The Gemara asks there should be Chashash of Chitu, and the Gemara says Yair Akura. And on that, the Gemara asks Chashash Shema Megis. Is there no greater? There should be no greater Hesach Hadas. I'm just taking the Ketera like Gabi Haish. Let's add a second shayla. Another kushiyat sumo if you follow this mahalach. The Mishnah in the beginning of Kira is mafurish that one can be masha on kashin gvava. Where's the hesach hadas for kashin gvava? There isn't. What's the heter by kashin gvava? Because kashin gvava, the eish is not liable for chitui to different mitzias. No. So enochanami the chashash of chitui solved, but there's a chashash of megis. It's avo eish. So we see mafurish that the Ramach is correct. That we're not being choishish from Megis once we don't have a chashash of chitui, even though there's no hesach hadas. There's a pleyat sumo. A similar svara that is said by that's the Chazoni Cheskel is said by Reb Shlomo Zalman. It's from his Ksavim that's printed in the Sefer Shulchan Shlomo in the beginning of Simration Gimel. Reb Shlomo Zalman has a tshuva from Ksav Yad that's published in there. It says the same svara. Al korchoch. We have to Al Korchoch, it's the Rambam L'shitasa of Hesach Hadas. And it's Mamash Lepel. It's Keneged the Gemara Mefureshes. And the Kashin Gvava is the Raya that Hagam that's Aloish and the Shaykh Megis still. We have a din that Al Koponim, we now can readily understand Rabbi Kivega's Kasha. That Rabbi Kiva, as we saw earlier in the Bir Halacha, asks on the Mechaber, that how can the Mechaber Ledina allow Shihia al Gabi Grufa V'Ktuma B'Pachas B'Machal Ben Drusoi? There should be a Chashash Megis. Va'al Toimar, because he was Mesiach Das. Mesiach Das is not an Eitzah. Gemara Mefuresh. And that's essentially Rabbi Kivega's kasha in the Mishnayos, where Rabbi Kivega says, so how do we begin the whole Mishnah of Parakira? How is she ever mutter? Ayu chashash megis. The only eitzah is going to be the teretz of the Ramban. That seva is different. Zod Rabbi Kivega, but we see that the Rishonim in Daf Yud Ches are masupik in the teretz of the Ramban. It's not pasha to the Rishonim in this teretz. So if we don't accept the teretz of the Ramban, how then do we mafanis in Furush Mishnah? Now, we have to pause for a moment because this is very Negea Halacha. We mentioned before that that the Bir Halacha is choishish to Rabbi Kivega Ledina, and he says the din of the Shulchan Aruch is loy berira kulei. Is Rabbi Kivega lashon of the Bir Halacha? Ein chidush Rabbi Kivega the din zeh einay bara, which means we're being choishish that one should not be able to broaden afkamina lemaisa. One cannot use garf and kotum for less than machal ben drusoi. The halacha seemingly is choishish to this Rabbi Kivega. The kasha on Rabbi Kivega is that al korchoch, this chashash is not valid. Why? Let's go back to the Ramach. The Ramach says any rishon that holds that there's bishul from machal ben drusoi until nigmar bishuloi, there's no way that shehiyah is mutter. Can't be, right? Can't be. Zod the Ramach, the only answer is the Rambam's not correct. Now, what's the sheet of the Mechaber? The sheet of the Mechaber is, like we began in Shin Yud Ches, that there's bishul from Machal ben Drusoi until Nizbashel called Tzarkai. So Ibazoyu, Al Karcha, what does the Mechaber hold? there must be some answer to the question. What's the answer to the question? Either there's no Megis because Tzeva is different, or Hesach Hadas somehow. Whatever answer you say. Now, whatever answer you're going to say is going to be an answer from Chai until Machal ben Drusai also. So, was will Rabbi Akiva Eiger? Halacha l'maaseh. The very Ramach that Rabbi Akiva Eiger is bringing, as you saw in the Gilin and the Mishnayos, that the Ramach says that there's an issue of Megis by every bishul. But Lamaisa, the Ramach says that doesn't fit with Shitas Rambam. It can't be. But the Mechaber Lamaisa does paskin like the Rambam. And if the Mechaber paskins like the Rambam, there must be an answer to the question. And the two answers to the question we know is either Hesach Hadas or that Tzeva is different. So that's true even from Chai until Machal ben Drusai. So where's Rabbi Akiva Eiger's child? Elamai, what we'll have to say is, this, as I state in Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that Rabbi Akiva Eiger is pointing out a fundamental nakuda in the sugi, and that is that according to those Rishonim that hold that there is no bishul from Machal ben Drusai until Nizbashal Kol Tzarkai, it actually emerges a chumrah that there can then be a chashash megis, and there should be no heter shia. So Zot Rabbi Akiva Eiger, we have no right to be maker like the Shulchan Aruch and say that al korach according to the Shulchan Aruch there is no din. If we see that according to the Cholkim of the Shulchan Aruch there is a chashash of megis, so that we have to be chayshish for both shittas. Both are true. Einach chanami the mechaber l'shitosoi is going to be muchrach to be makel, but we can't assume the chumrah of the Shulchan Aruch l'gabe bishul that would create a kula l'gabe shemo yogis. So Mamela Zot Rabbi Akiva Eiger, we Ladina have to be chayshish both ways. We have to be chayshish both ways. Is Mamela Zot Rabbi Akiva Eiger Ebazoy it's Leibrira and Ladina the chashash shadumi. Now what we'll finish with is, and this will be a Yisai Beis Hashem in the sugya of Shia, that these two kashas that we're asking on the Hesach Hadas Svara, one from Yoira Akura, that there's still a Chashash Megis, and two, that how does Kashan Gvava solve the problem? Both these kashas I found by Hashem in the sefer called Menorah HaTahira, the Talmud of the Maggid Mezrich, a very sadistic sefer on Hilchos Shabbos. The Menorah HaTahira says the same Svara as Chatzkel Abramsky. The Rambam is L'shitosai because of Hesach Hadas, and he then asks both these kashas. Interestingly, on the second kasha from Kashan Gvava, that Kashan Gvava involves no Hesach Hadas, he remains b'tarachian on the Shaila and therefore dismisses the teretz. And says, Al Korchach, we have to say L'shitz Rambam that Tzeva is different from Kedeir. If you have a moment, we'll try and come back to suggest the teretz for that Shaila. But on the first Shaila, that how can the Gemara at once say that Yoira Akura takes care of the chashash of Shema Yichata, but still there's a din of Megis? So the Menorah HaTorah says the following. He says something which is soft, and we'll try and just briefly explain it. He says, after the Yoira Chashino Mahagos Gam Ba'okur Min Ha'ish, by Yoira by Tzeva L'Choshesh, the Loi Mahani Hasochas Daitoi, Mikol Mokain B'Kedeira Efshe V'Gilu Das Mahani. He says there's a difference between a Yoira of Tzeva and a Kedeira of a Tavshel. Not b'negea to chitui, but b'negea to the Hesach. Does Hesach Hadas accomplish b'negea to chashash megis? According to the Menorah HaTorah, the structure is as follows: b'negea to chitui, they're identical, and that we need Yoira Akura. Does Yoira Akura solve the problem, or whatever would take care of the issue of Shema Yichata? Would that solve the problem of megis? Then it depends. Yoira no, and Kedeira yes. At Kandvar doesn't say why. At Kandvar, this is what he says. Yoira chashino lahagosa, mashen b'Kedeira efshel b'glu das mahani.
The Ramban. That's really the Ramban.
That no, the Ramban is being mechalik that entirely that we're chayshish differently by we're chayshish entirely different. That's not what he's saying. He's being mechalik between Tzeva and the Yisod Advarim is that and this was asked before, functionally, how is Shema Yichata different to Megis? Seemingly both of them are to be Mamar Bishal. So let's quote briefly a Dover Pele, which we find that Rabbi Akiva Eiger brings in the beginning of Siman Shin Ches in Shulchan Aruch. It's also at the beginning of the Rambam in Perek Tes of Hilchos Shabbos, where the Rabbi Akiva Eiger says the following. He says, Im yesh basar al gabi gecholim. Let's say we have a piece of meat on top of coals. And if he doesn't turn it over, mizbashal b'shtei shois. It will take 2 hours to cook. V'al yedei hahipuch, by turning it over, mizbashal b'shah achas. It will take an hour to cook. Zot Rabbi Akiva Eiger yesh loymar dechayev. We can suggest that he'd be chayev. The kroive bishulei milsahi. Because hurrying the bishul is an act of bishul. Where does Rabbi Akiva Eiger know that from? He found a ritva in Shavuos on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis b'soich dvarov, where the ritva discusses the shaila. Frekter Shachan Avi Ezri in the beginning of Perek Tes, he says, "Isn't that Megas? That's what Megas says. What does Megas do? The Rishonim say it's Memar Bishulai. So, is there a suffix about this? That's bishul. We're muchrach to say b'shittas haritva. And our strong requirements that other Rishonim agree with this, that it's fundamentally choluk megis and bishul. And so you say that's today to bear in mind when we will learn Beis Hashem and bishul further, the sugi of megis, very, very important yisoid. What's mavur in this Rabbi Akiva Eiger is that megis enhances bishul, and chitui hurries the bishul. Why am I being mechate? It's lemaher bishulai. It's just simply to make it proceed. That the Ritva says to me maher bishulai. If it would be misbashal anyway, I don't know if that's bishul. Yes, no, sofik. The Ritva wants to make a tushtel to a sugya of benegeh to chiyuv zar and avodah, that maybe that's considered to be a malacha. Megis is enhancing the bishul. That's what it does. Memela zot the menera Torah nifla. Hesach hadas helps that I'm not thinking about is it going to be ready. I've been Mesiach Das. It's going to take this amount of time. I'm going to take it when I'm ready to take it. I'm not involved in being memaher the bishul. But would I want to enhance the bishul? Different child. Memele zoter itvo by a stamp tavshil. I'm not interested in enhancing the bishul. I'll leave it. It's cooking fine. It's dafka by a yoira that there I'm concerned with the quality of the tzeva. Memele zoter there hesach hadas won't help. It's two separate nedanim. The Ramban said, no, yoira b'chlal is different. The whole chashash of Shem HaMegis was only nema by yoira, and it was never said by tavshil. Zot the Menorah Torah, no, avad is said by tavshil. And Reb Shlomo, we're being clear, just hesach hadas will solve it by tavshil, and it won't solve it by yoira. Why? And that's why the Gemara asked the kasha. Zot the Gemara said, Einachanami yoira akuro would solve the problem by tavshil, because by tavshil the metzias is I'm not involved in enhancing the bishul. I only may want to be memahir the bishul. Oh, garf and kotel. Masha'inkin by yoira, no, I'm involved in enhancing the bishul. That would be then a solution to that kushya summa. Oh, we didn't get to Kash and Gavo yet. So Kash and Gavo, we mentioned that the Menorah Torah remains with Tzarachin on the Shayla. Possibly we can suggest, and this is a Shehiyah Chiddush, which will end the limud with Beis Hashem, is that if one's medayek carefully the lashon of the Rambam in Perigimel, where the Rambam brings the halach of Hesach Hadas, the Rambam is mavur that Kash and Gvava also involves Hesach Hadas.
The whole page, correct. Let's put the Rambam back on.
Hashaharei ein shom gecholim boyaros harei ze mutal hashay saleo sheharei hisiach daitoi. Bir hadvarim is that when the usual way of tafshil is to leave it on gecholim. If one leaves it on kash and gvava, then I'm no longer involved in the bishul. I'm just allowing the bishul to end. Zot the Rambam, that possibly could also be considered mesiach daitoi. So we can suggest then a yishuv for both kashas. The first kash of the Menorah Tahira says that there's a difference in what Hesach Hadas accomplishes with Egeh Techitui than what accomplishes the Gabi Megis. And that's where the Yesod Nifla that's Mavur from Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Then we have the Eitzah of Then we have the Eitzah of the Rambam in Yesod. So just to conclude the halacha, all of this discussion of Isai is only minei bein shittas Rambam, because we're answering with hesech hadas, like the Menera Torah says. But the Rishonim that learn it's mishum heker won't have this teretz. Oy bazay l'shitason, we have the kasha. What's with megis? Zot the bir halacha, we have to be choshesh to Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Ledina zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, in that same tshuva, we can always use the teretz of the Ramban that it's only tzeva, and the mela the mechaber is miyushav, and therefore Ledina zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, we don't have to be choshesh to the bir halacha and Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And taka. No, but only going to get to Yaira, not going to get to Tefsha. So that Ledina would be the maskana that the Bir Allah that we're choshesh to, the Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman Lemaisa will be mechalik between Seva and between Tefsha. Just to conclude with the Bir Agoda, began Chodesh Iyar, and Kayadua from the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Gerushin. One doesn't write to get in Chodesh Iyar. The reason why is because there's a machlokes akadmonim if Iyar is spelled mole with 2 yuds or spelled only with 1 yud. Is Iyar aleph yud reish or aleph yud yud reish? So mele by a get, unless it's nachutz mipnei igun or other tzorech, one doesn't write to get the Chodesh Iyar. Iyar has one spelling aleph yud reish, there's a second spelling aleph yud yud reish. In kadmonim it's mavur that the Deutsch Rishumas bring that Iyar Choser and Iyar Mole are 2 different Rashi tapes. Iyar Choser is Ani Hashem Reifecha. Iyar Mole is Avram Yitzchak Yaakov Roch. It states in Ksavim. Avram Yitzchak Yaakov Roch. What does Avram Yitzchak Yaakov Rochel mean? It's the 3 of us. And Rochel means that the Osid Lavoi in Olam Hazeh, Yaakov and Leah are buried separately. Yaakov and Rachel are buried separately. Only the zivug is between Yaakov and Leah. They're together in Maras Machpelah. Also, Lovoi, this man, Gilui Hashalom, there'll be a concept of the zivug between Yaakov and Rachel. That's something that we're teifer to. Also, Lovoi, Ani Hashem Reifecha is looking towards. So either it's Ani Hashem Reifecha, or Chodesh Iyar is looking towards Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Rachel. Now, l'chore in the concept, in the Mahus Advarim, one can't imagine a greater steer between the two. Ani Hashem Reifecha is referring to Klal Yisrael Chas v'Shalom being in Chaylim. Ani Hashem Reifecha, the Hashem is Merapeh Chaylim. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Rachel is a vision of Klal Yisrael b'shleimus that we don't experience even in Olam Hazeh yet. That's Gula Asida. Somehow both elements are inherent to Chodesh Iyar. How do we understand that? So just to quote a Dover Nifla that is Mavur and the Shem Shmuel of the Parsha Shmini, has one piece there on Chodesh Iyar. And he says like this. He says in the Zohar HaKadosh it says that it says in the Tur that the Yud Beis Chadashim Keneged Yud Beis Shvatim, the Cheshbon it begins that Nisan is Keneged Ruvain, Iyar is Keneged Shimon, and so too progressing through the Yud Beis Shvatim. So Ibazai steht in Zohar HaKadosh that Nisan is Ruvain, Al Shem ki Ro'a Hashem, and Iyar is Shimon ki Shoma Hashem. Leah called Ruvain Ro'a Hashem Ba'ani. Shimon was called ki Shoma Hashem. What's the difference of the Shem Mishmuel between the Re'iyah of Chodesh Nisan and the Shmiyah of Chodesh Iyar? He explains it in a very basic way. He says like this. He says all of Gulas Mitzrayim is described in terms of Re'iyah. Always le'einenu. The Giluyim of Chodesh Nisan achieved a level and a clarity and a familiarity of Re'iyah. Says Masha'in Kain Chodesh Iyar, the Chodesh that follows, that's Keneged Shmiyah. The hachana to Matan Torah was a hachana to be both royim and shemim. The kol royim es hakolos shemim. Both. The hachana of Chodesh Iyar is miyuchas to Shmiyah. How is Shmiyah different to Re'iyah? Shmiya is always more distant. Einoi doime shmiya l're'iyah. Re'iyah is the greatest level of confirmation that we can have is what one sees le'inenu. Shmiya is always Roya ani as dvarecha means absolute agreement. Shemeh ani as dvarav means it's enough to be able to be done. Re'iyah is always a more comprehensive heichacha than Shmiya is. Memela, just to quote the lashon of the Shem Yishmuel here, and he says, "Kvar marnu that Indian hatiyas oizem. What's the idea of Shmiya? Hainu lirdoif achar oimek hakavon of lo yistapik b'shitchiyas ha'in. Shema Yisrael Havaya Lekeinu Havaya Echad. What does that mean? It says the Rashban Tshuva. It means to be maven. The Havana, the ability to discern the Metzias of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Bria is called Shmiya. So Mele, he says, like someone who pays close attention, not just to hear the sound, but to hear the nuance in someone else's dibur. It says, Kein hu b'chodesh hazeh shetzorich adam lehaskil el hakavana. Shahamavukush meha adam, the ikr that the Rebbeinu Shalom wants from a person, einenu kshuroyes elikus be'enov. It's not the madreg of Chodesh Nisan where everything is obvious and open. If you deep Shemayim like Malachim, we'd see much more openly. After the Nisan of Chodesh Nisan, the Rebbeinu Shalom gave us a glimpse of what lies underneath it all. But our avodah is to then be shoymim, to discern what's hidden, to discern what's inherent, to discern what's bepnim. That's the avodah of Chodesh Iyar. The entire avodah of being Mekabel Torah is the ability to take a mundane bria and discern in it the Ratzon of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Memele Zokte B'Shem Yishmuel Nifla. Chodesh Nisan is Kineged Ruvain, that's Riyah. The Rebbeinu Shalom gave us a glimpse openly of what lies inherent in the Bria. But the Ikar Avodah is to then use that as a signal post to what we're supposed to discern in the entire Elam Hazeh. That's the Avodah of Chodesh Iyar. Zokte Shem Yishmuel, how does one do that? He says, what's the accomplishment? Likvoya atzmoi ki yosed shaloi timoit shiurim kesidron l'Torah. For a person to be kivea a kvios in Esek HaTorah, because Torah is the greatest key to discerning the inherent kavana of the Bria. Like Torah, we was zeichet to alidei shmir be'ikr. Was royim as hakaylos. That was some additional giluyim, but the ikr oifen of Kabbalah's Torah was alidei shmir. Oizen zusha shoma ba'ar Sinai. Shmir. What does shmir mean? Because Torah is the vehicle for which we discern the meaning of the Bria. Memele Zokte Shem Yishmuel, the ikr avoid of Chodesh Iyar is likvoya atzmei ki yosed shaloi timot shirim kesidron l'Torah l'tefila limtzoy helei kus af b'mei hester. That's the contrast between Chodesh Nisan and Chodesh Iyar. Ashreichem that we're kivea with this medrash kvias itim, which will be our chizuk for Chodesh Iyar and will carry us through Be'ez Hashem to Matan Torah.
HaRav, to our Choshev Zoom, we'll try to chazir this year. Not sure how, but we'll try to chazir this year.